So I'm the white elephant lady. I want to thank Grant Abbott, not only for coming here today, but for a wonderful phone conversation we had about 6 weeks ago when we were beginning to set this up. Sometimes you go out and you do some of this work or you write books and you don't know if you're still touching on something that's important or relevant or whatever. You find from people. I've been doing consulting enough so that I do get emails every week from teachers who say, I really needed to know some of the stuff that's in your book. I don't meet people as often as I used to, but I do go out and do consulting and meet people. But more of it is coming through emails. And they're saying, what about a book on this? Why don't you try a book on this? Why don't we explore it from this angle? So it's wonderful to be able to come here and just have an hour together to focus on race and on equity and on white privilege, because it is often the thing, the part of the story that is left out. And to me, the achievement gap is about race. That's what the gap is about. The gap is about the gap between students of color and white students. So it seems disingenuous to keep talking about this without addressing race itself, since that is implied in the definition. I'd like to read it. I always open with a poem, just because I wrote poetry and still do. And what I have found when I work in schools that are working well, and I went to Baltimore a couple of weeks ago and found some wonderful schools there, wonderful schools in Minnesota, wonderful schools all over. And what I'm finding when I come into schools that are working well is there seems to not be this barrier between the kids and the families' lives and the school building. And when I've talked to high school students in the past, over the years, they often say, well, yeah, I'll go to school and I'll try real hard, but it's not like my real life. It's not my real life. And I think the more we can focus on schools that are actually making it part of the kids' real life, and that involves neighborhood people coming in and working in the halls or working as aides or working as teachers. To me, and this is a huge gap in our educational system right now, we have 85 to 89% white teachers every year in this country. Well, when you look at that then, you see what's left. And so you have many kids right now who are going into schools and never seeing a teacher who looks like them. Not for their whole elementary career, maybe even their high school, junior high school career. That is part of that real life connection that the kids aren't feeling in the schools. So here is a poem about a time when my life, watching the kids and what we were doing at North High School seemed to come together in this poem. It's called Praise. Actually, it's about an incident, a time when I was teaching at St. Thomas, which is nearby here. That's a little backstory. Baggy pants draped to the ground, flannel shirts and starter jackets that reached their wrists. The kids were standing on the corner waiting for love. They don't talk about it. Love's too tender for styling. Up in the image, white and black, they play at anger, and sometimes they succeed. In the winter dawn of first hour at North High, Khalid asks, where is the love? And for a moment they start to answer. At home in my kitchen, under the front porch step, and then they stop and shake their heads and say, you're crazy, man, talking about love. Silence. One dark-eyed boy asks, what I want to know is how come more people don't hang out with their grams much anymore, and what is that? Is that like about history? Khalid turns to us later as we sit around a table in a seminar room that overlooks downtown streetlights, lampposts draped for Christmas. He says, the hallways are spiritual places. He talks about how the kids are into rap and hip-hop and wearing the newest brand of clothes. One boy is going into the army so he can send his check to his mom. One girl's grandmother is dying over on Queen Avenue just off Plymouth. This girl cannot bear to go to visit her now, does not want to forget the color and the food and the music and the love that were there for years of her own growing. She refuses to replace memory with sour smell, wisps of hair on balding head, loud breathing that almost stops. And Khalid asks, how come nobody ever talks about love anymore? I say, I think we are afraid of tenderness. He laughs at that and says, okay, give me a tender moment on the streets. And I say that one evening in the middle of teaching a college class, I found out that my mother had died. Lamont Wilson, a student of mine, walked me to the parking lot singing spirituals in the fading April light. Just to start, you're on your way home, he said, smiling, leaning and humming into the car window. Khalid grins under his blue-brimmed hat and says, now there is a story there. And prays, perhaps, for all the moments in all the hallways in all our lives that come to that. Someone knowing the right song, the right question, spiritual, you know. And now it is time to talk to the kids. Earphones circling their heads, eyes closed to the beat. Now it is time to talk some more about love. When I read that poem often, and there are ministers or priests or imams or spiritual leaders in the audience, they ask me about why schools don't talk about love much anymore. And I like that question, and I think that'd be one to ponder. We know the numbers, and in a recent editorial, I'll just read a few that worry all of us. It was an editorial in the Star Tribune, and it was from the NAEP information. And it said, Minnesota's African American students score worse than their black peers in the Deep South. The gap between low-income 8th graders and their more affluent counterparts is almost the worst in the country. Trade? Oh, better to...
Just go ahead, Tom.
Oh, wait a minute, I'll just... Okay. Is this okay?
Much better. Can you repeat that, what you just said?
The last one before, okay. The gap between low-income 8th graders and their more affluent counterparts is almost the worst in the country. That means within our state, this gap between rich and poor kids is one of the worst, biggest gaps in the country. Minnesota Latino and black students are second and third from the bottom among their peers of the same race in other states. When I do talks and I read these statistics, I rarely hear people often don't even ask me questions about race or racism at first. And often they'll want to say things like, you know, it's all about class, really. It's all about class. And I'll mention some reasons why that's not true. I don't understand why this is still happening when we have studies that we're hearing about now. And there are a lot of studies done on young children. There was a wonderful issue of Newsweek that had at the cover, "Watch See Baby Discriminate." Did you? And what it did, and I've got a whole packet of research that goes with that article, but it talked about at 6 weeks of age, kids see differences and notice differences. Of course, it's the weight that's attached and the tone of voice and the attitude attached to those differences. But they are noticing differences immediately. And what they're finding is that what is important in addressing negative views of others is being explicit about race and racism and talking to young children as early as kindergarten or even sooner. And I'm editing now a new book that I'm bringing out probably in about a year. And I have chapters in that book, and it's called Going Deeper, and it's about having conversations about race. And we start with chapters talking about preschool age, talking about race. One thing they found in the research, by the way, is parents of color do have these conversations, probably 3 or 4 times as often. And when white parents talk about race, and these are all well-meaning, this is not intentional, when they talk about race, they talk about equality for all, and nobody's any different. We're all the same. And they don't address the actual life that's going on around race and racism. They don't, especially when the kids get older. And believe me, the kids know it. The kids know what's going on. They go into a store with their friends who are black, and they start walking through that store, and the white kids will come out and tell you, my black friends were followed all the way through that mall. Nothing I can do. Nobody followed me. So the kids want these conversations, and that's really what I'm trying to say, is that in high schools, in middle schools, in 6th and 5th and 4th grade, of course tailored developmentally to the age of those kids, but they want this conversation. They're hungry for it. So I'd love to see in the question and answer, and I mean to have one for a half an hour, somebody put into words why this is so hard for people now. I want to know why we're not doing this. I want to know why when I go to do trainings at schools, people sit with their arms folded and start reading their grade books because they don't want to even look up when this conversation begins. I don't know what we're afraid of, frankly, because I think there's fear at the base of some of this. We could talk about gender, we could talk about poverty, but I find also that when I do talks, those are the things people are more comfortable talking about. So we'll flip it over. By the end of the day, we're talking about gender. By the end of the day, we're talking about poverty. And it is a way to avoid having the talk about race. Gloria Ladson-Billings, who I will show you in this clip in a few minutes, who teaches out of Madison and wrote a marvelous book called The Dream Keepers, Successful Teachers of African American Children. She's an amazing woman. I've been really honored to be on panels with her at times, and I will tell you one story from that in a minute. But she says that cultural competency is a state of being. And you'll see in her clip, it's a state of almost unconscious assumptions that we need to look at kids and work with kids from where they come from. And if it's a wide variety, we try to understand that variety. And then we understand that each kid is bringing their own unique personality. And it's a tricky thing. It's a very tricky thing, but she gets at it. And I believe that being a white person in the U.S. is a state of being. I think there are things we assume and things, the way we live, and we are not conscious of it. We are not conscious of it. And we're not conscious of the vigilance it takes. And I'm asking everyone here to go back and talk to people about that it's not having Julie come out for 3 hours. It's not having one conversation. If you go back to it your entire life. I have had things happen in the last 6 months where I've had to say, why did I assume that? Why in the world did I think that? Luckily, I've been with people who are willing to talk to me about it, or patient. There is another good book I want to recommend, and then I won't overwhelm you, but I'm reading it now, and it's called The White Racial Frame. Has anybody? Oh, what a book. I mean, I'm seeing in that book so much more about what I need to know. There are invisible white privileges that we have, and that, if you want to really get the classic person on that, it's Peggy McIntosh from Wellesley College, and she has put together 46, in her long paper, 46 specific white privileges that we have in the world. One of them, for instance, is I can go into a bank and I can be assured that I will get a fair loan arrangement. I'll be able to buy a car with a decent interest rate. and I'll be able to get that without worrying that it may be denied to me on the basis of my skin color. Because we still know that studies are coming up, and my son just did this a couple of weeks ago in New York. They hired him as an actor to go to apartment buildings where they think there's been just blatant discrimination when people come to look for places to live. And he's the white guy. And they give him a briefcase, and he said it's a good deal because they do his hair, a little roughly executive hairdo. And he goes in, and first an African-American man dressed the same way, same resume, same everything, goes in, and they tell him in the apartment building, sorry, that unit's just gone. We just missed you. Aaron will go in 2 hours later, and not only will they say, sure, we'll show you that unit, but we'll also show you 3 others that are available. So one of the frustrating things for so many friends of mine is people thinking this is all over and we've taken care of this now. We've elected a black president, so we must just be, we have it together. No. One of the ways Peggy McIntosh says that you can, that she's learning a lot about what's happening in the world is to talk to parents who are white, who have adopted children of color. They have very interesting observations. I ran into some parents at a school in southwest Minneapolis, an elementary school, and I was sitting at a table, we were working together, and they were white parents. And they said what happens to them is that they go in and they sit in the office and wait for their child to come down to the office where they're going to meet him and take him for a doctor appointment or something. And they sit there, and because the people in the office really don't know who they are, really, they've called up to the teacher's going to send down, the people in the office will talk about, as assuming there's a certain understanding between them all because they're white. And they will say outrageous things about kids of color. This isn't, of course, in every school, but I think one of the things that it is important to say, and there was a palpable anger that night on the part of some of these parents of kids of color, because they are hearing things and it felt to them like people are not listening to what's needed. I have a friend named Bev Rollwagon, and Bev and her husband John adopted two babies actually from Colombia. And I was doing this work along with, seeing her off and on, and she said to me about 2 or 3 years ago, she said, I didn't get what you were doing with this race stuff. I didn't get it until Jake got to be 16. And what happens when Jake gets to be 16 is he's a brown kid driving a Mercedes-Benz. Because Bev says we've got great cars, right? And what happens is Jake would pull into the driveway and a cop car would pull in right after him, assuming that he was either stealing the car or shouldn't be driving it anyway, assuming he didn't even belong in the neighborhood. There's a judge who has talked on 60 Minutes about how humiliating it was when he went to a mall on a Saturday afternoon to buy a gift for his wife in a jewelry store, and 2 guards were called in and they took him into an office and accused him of stealing. He had nothing in his pockets. This isn't a matter of class. Those people are middle class. My friend who taught at Carleton until about a year ago and was a professor and emeritus now, has lived in Northfield for over 40 years. I've taught at Carleton off and on, but I haven't been there for, I'd go down and it would have been 20 years since I went, and then I fill in for somebody there. I've done it a couple times. She's African American. She goes into a grocery store, and she's still asked by the people there for her ID when she's ready to buy something. I go in, and I've been there for 10 years, and nobody asked me that. And it's really what we call microaggressions. It's the small, day-by-day things that happen. And so what it does, and what white privilege work does, instead of directing everything at those things and saying, what are we going to do, this is awful, what it does is flip it a little and say, at least to get grounded in this, think about what our privileges are as white people. Because it's almost easier if we just put it off and say, oh, I really feel bad about that. Without looking at what this means for us. There was a man named Joe White, if any of you have ever met this amazing man. He's 75. He was one of the first people to graduate, black men to graduate from De La Salle. And he actually picked up a copy of A White Teacher Talks About Race and called me one day on the phone and said, Julie, this is Doc White. And I had no idea who Doc White was. And he's a professor at Irvine. Grew up in Minnesota. Talks about getting in trouble with Prince's mom. That's why his mother sent him to California. Got in trouble with Prince's mom. And I met him the other morning. When he comes into town, we have breakfast when we can. And I did some work on the African American Men Project with him. And we've become really close. This was about 15 years ago when we got in touch with him. And he came in and he said, I'm just having one of those days. He said, I get up early, I go to the place to work out, and somebody asks me for my room key, and I'm standing there and I give it to them, and then somebody else comes in and wants a towel, and they don't get asked for the room key. He said, I know, I'm 75, this should just be water off my back. But it isn't. It isn't. And the kids see this too. The kids watch. We had a friend who had a son, a black son at St. Paul Academy. And he said once he was giving his final presentation, senior paper, whatever, and he said, you know, I thought I had seen he listed all the things that had happened to him in terms of his race. That he was even hauled off to jail while his white friends that were out in the street with him just playing football weren't. He listed these things. But he said, I've never really felt it as deeply as I felt it at St. Paul Academy. And it was a moment for St. Paul Academy, it was 10, 15 years ago, to think about why. And he spelled it out a little. He spelled out the lack of expectation, some assumptions about him, that he wouldn't be able to do the work. But it was a tough moment, and yet an important moment, and a brave moment for this young man. He went on to Brown University, and then I think he might even be a lawyer now. Depends on how you feel about lawyers. I think the way I kind of just try to describe generally what my privilege is as a white person is to say, it is not to be the subject of such hostility, aggression, humiliation based on the color of my skin. I don't have to deal with that. I'm not expected to represent my race. Oh wow, we were at an afternoon on Saturday with a friend, and we had a very mixed group of people talking about race, and almost everyone that was there that was either African American or Latino said, one thing I really get tired of is people expecting me to be speaking from my race. Or, if I'm in an altercation, somebody's going to say, those black people, you know. There was a moment at North High School when somebody came to, this happens at North, somebody came to see how the black students felt the day O.J. Simpson was acquitted. And that other things happen like that. And North High kids are very interesting in that way. They don't get real hyped up for the media because they often feel misrepresented in the media anyway. So I was the kid taking out books to my car to help me. And somebody came up with a microphone and said, did you hear O.J. Simpson was acquitted today? What does that mean for you? What does that mean? And he said, I don't want to talk. So we put the books in the car, and before he went up, I said to him, what would you have liked to have said if you really felt you'd be listened to? And he said, what I'd say, this is what he said in his own way, what I'd say is, do you go to a white suburban high school when that Kennedy guy, that's the way he put it, when that Kennedy guy's nephew was acquitted of rape, and say, what does this mean for young white men now? Of course we don't care. Of course we don't. We're the default individual. So everything that we do just reflects on us as an individual. And that is in the more institutional scheme of things. I know that you could run into stuff where you don't feel that, but in general, we are not asked. I had a young Carleton student who said to me, he said, I was the only student of color in all of maybe Columbus, Ohio, somewhere, schools in my class. And he said, what would happen is on every day that came up, and his father was from India. His name was Ari. And every day, every time they had a week coming up or a Black History Month or whatever, they'd come to Ari and say, what do you think we ought to do for Black History Month? This is Native Week. What do you think we ought to do on Indigenous People Week? And he would, you know, you're 16 and 17, do you want to be singled out anyway for anything? He would always say, don't know, have no clue. My father's from India, the country, India. But that may be a far-reaching example, but that's what happens. That's what happens with kids. They see it, and the other kids see it too. I think that all of this relates to education, gets back to that barrier. And so I think what it's important to do is to work on breaking down the barrier between our kids and the school building. And that can involve, I remember sitting out and seeing this wonderful school where parents were going in and out and kids were running in and out. And it was the end of the day, but there was stuff going on in the afternoon and stuff going on in the evening, and it was wonderful. It was wonderful. I don't think they did real well on the standardized tests. And maybe in question and answer we can talk about the bias in those tests and really what's happened to schools, because we've now focused on a reading test and a math test pretty much. What has happened to the curriculum? What has happened to the, what's driven out teachers? What has driven out teachers? I know excellent teachers that have left the profession because they can't teach in a prescriptive way, in a kind of a military style way. And a way that says, it's 9:10, you should be teaching short vowel A. I don't know, we went a little long with that circle meeting this morning, and there are little people that come around and check it off. The most creative teachers can't teach that way. And they have good test results too. It's not that. I really believe that if we were doing this to white kids, there is nobody I know in my whole circle of friends who now have, some of them have grandkids, who would want their kids taught in a rote, boring, military style. I also, and I want to put a plug in here, partly just for teachers because they are being bombarded with negative stuff and huge responsibility, and I do think poverty might have something to do with some of that. You know, some of the fact that kids need free breakfast and free lunch and even take home a snack for dinner. There are schools that are doing that, and they're really, really doing well. But I think the most creative teachers are the ones who are trying to connect to kids personally. And we're not letting them do that in many ways. We're not letting them do that if they're teaching 40 kids an hour, 5 hours a day. And we have high schools in the Twin Cities where the class size is going up to 40 kids an hour. And then we complain because the teachers aren't reaching every individual. Now, if you look, and there's a movement afoot to increase class sizes, that's the way we'll save money. If you look at the people that are pushing this, it's people who went to schools where they still brag. in the private school brochure, somebody did a great research article on this. We never go beyond 16 kids an hour in our classrooms here at Fancy, Fancy, Fancy. You know, we have seminar-style learning. These are the people, some of them, well-meaning in many cases, who went to schools that still brag about that. So why are we doing this to the poorest or to the kids that are in trouble or to whatever? Why are we doing this? I wonder if it's the curriculum that creates barriers, and I thought I'd just read a little piece from Growing Up White that was my last book, because it has to do with language. And it's the first lesson. From my most unconscious moments, I was spoken to and sung to in white dialect. I started out with whiteness bending over my bassinet in the night, singing, "Au clair de la lune, rockabye baby." I did not hear a southern drawl or an Italian accent like my friend Guy Pucci still had. In an essay from the book, The Skin That We Speak, Lisa Delpit describes what happens when children learn that their mother's way of speaking, their father's way of singing, is wrong. The result is to stamp out not only the child, but those from whom the child first received nurturance, from whom she first felt love, from whom she first smiled. There is a reason our first language is called our mother tongue. I think of parents holding their babies so that music and skin become one, and I wonder what happens when such beauty is designated not beautiful. What do we do when we tear kids away from this continuum of sound and song, these first moments they enter the classroom? What would happen if we used all the voices and songs as a basis for story and connection? For instance, in recognizing Ebonics as a gift, as a form of bilingualism, and celebrating this in poetry and prose, school becomes a place where African American students are not crossing into unfamiliar territory when they enter the front door. Hearing her mother's song and speech in some context of her elementary class helps a young child make a visceral connection between the two physical locations of her life, home and school. Later, reading Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, or Toni Morrison, she will feel the connection between home and great literature, dialect, and mainstream English in a more conceptual way. And there's a wonderful quote from Henry Louis Gates who says, "I want it all. I want Shakespeare and August Wilson. I want grits and I want crepes. I want it all." And there's absolutely no reason that that can't be part of how we work in our schools. And actually, if you read The Rise for Watching God, what you see is a marvelous combination of kind of standard English and dialect. And it's an interesting novel to bring to kids, because they see them side by side. I thought I'd play this clip now, but I'm a little worried about time. It's about 8 minutes. Okay. Why don't we play Gloria's clip?
Volume up.
Translate, not eradicate their language. So a teacher might say something like, okay, you say, my mama, she, be here at 8 o'clock. A translation to an American edited version of that would be, my mother will be here at 8 o'clock. The meaning is the same. And what you really haven't done is said to the kid, what you say is incorrect. What you said is that that's a translatable sentence, and this is how it sounds in this new translation. However, there are actually instances where you want kids to hold on to that African American vernacular. If they're reading the poetry of Paul Laurence Dunbar, there reading Langston Hughes. He does use vernacular. And then for just some instrumental purposes, you want kids to be able to talk to other kids. So, and have friendships and be able to develop relationships. So that language that they start with is a language that they are going to communicate in. We all have what I would call informal languages. We don't want to single out one group of kids and say, you may not use your informal language. One of the teachers talked about having a Halloween party. And she said, I brought in enough food for all of the kids to enjoy the treats. She said, I passed out all the treats, and no sooner than I passed out all the treats, kids were asking for more. And I kept thinking, they couldn't possibly need more. I gave plenty of treats. She said, what I didn't know at that time is that part of their value system was you bag up your treats so that you take them home to share them with siblings and other family members. So she said, I learned pretty quickly. What you do is you actually give out sort of half of the treats, and you say to the kids, this is the amount of treats that you can have to take home. And she said, they all bag them up, and then she said, now I'm passing out your treats. And she said, but I had to learn that. I could have rejected it and thought, well, I'm not giving these kids anything else. But what I learned from them is that sharing with family members is really an important aspect of the value system from which they were coming. She says, that was really perfect for me to learn, because I learned that family matters so much that even when you're in school, you got to remember who's at home. I think that culturally competent teachers think of their students as a group of people from whom they can learn. One of my colleagues at Northwestern University, Carol Lee, talks about a classroom in which she was studying teachers, and the teacher that she was working with would always say, you have to study the students. And that's what culturally competent teachers do. They don't presume that just because a student is of a particular race or ethnicity, that they already know what that student is like. Even if that race or ethnicity is exactly the same as theirs. They literally study the student. And because every group of students is a new group, they look for cues, they look for indicators from the students as to how best to meet their needs. That's part of that cultural competence. I think a lot of times teachers are overwhelmed when you say cultural competence, because they'll say, well, I have students from Somalia, I have students from Mexico, I have I talk about okay. I mean, one of the mysteries, how do we start to think about kids' potential? The 11th grader who walks in with the hat on backwards and looks like the next rapper, or the 5th grader who comes in threadbare, or how do we think about their potential? Who do we think these youngsters are going to be? It turns out most of us are pretty poor judges of that. So a culturally competent teacher knows there's no point in making an assumption. You know, I always say to my own students, do you actually think that Martin Luther King's 4th grade teacher said, oh my goodness, Martin Luther King Jr. is here? She probably said, this is Reverend King's son. I guess I have to work with him, but, you know, these preachers' kids are maybe a pain in the neck. That's a very human response to have. But it wasn't. But you can't know. So you don't know where the next cure for cancer is coming from. You don't know where Bill Gates is sitting. You have no idea where Toni Morrison is. You don't have any clue that Cesar Chavez is sitting there ready to, at some point in his life, lead farmers. So you have to teach as if they're in that country. They're there somewhere. That's what you see among culturally competent teachers. This pushing and stretching of kids because they have no way of knowing, you know, where the next genius resides. One of the teachers in my study had a wonderful sign outside her door, and it said, quiet, geniuses at work. So she had this visible symbol that she shared with the school community, but with her own students about who she she thought they were. She was constantly telling them how smart they were. Even when they were struggling, she would say, okay, but you're smart. The other thing that you often see among culturally competent teachers is their understanding that there's probably more expertise distributed in the classroom than there is within any one person. So much of their work is work that helps kids collaborate and contribute to work with each other. There's an interesting discourse that is going on about kids who come to school not ready for school. I probably am one of those people who falls on the fringe of the discourse. Because I actually think if you're 5, you ought to be able to come to school. I don't think you need to have a whole lot of stuff. I think you actually should have the right to begin. So what does beginning mean for me? It means that you pretty much are 5 years old and you can make it to the bathroom 3 out of 5 times. I don't know, you ever make it all the time? Trust me, people in my age group don't make it 3 out of 5. We allow children to begin. There's a frightening pattern that's going to happen in American education that suggests that if children don't come to school already knowing how to read, that they get treated like they have no right to be taught. That's wrong. 5-year-olds know a lot of stuff. How do I know they know a lot of stuff? Because they almost all come to us with a whole language that they learn without us. They probably get confident at every single thing they try. They learn to walk. No one said, oh boy, well you fell. You didn't meet that standard. You can't proceed and walk. They just kept at it until they got good at it. They learn to talk. They make new sentences every day. There's a lot of stuff that they already have. And they have a right to begin. Beginning means learning new things, building off whatever they can, and having the privilege of being in a classroom with a teacher who believes no matter where they started, they have a right to proceed along with other 5-year-olds. So I'm not as concerned with what they don't have. I'm much more concerned with what it is that we have as educators to offer.
Who is that?
Her name is Gloria Ladson Billings, and her book is The Dream Keeper, Successful Teachers of African American Children. Thank you. She has a wonderful story about, she's talking about gifted and talented. There were some kids that were at a school, regular 5th graders, and they said they had 2 classrooms across the street that had GATE written above their classroom doors. And these kids were not in the GATE classes, but they didn't know what the GATE classes were. So they said to the teacher, what does GATE mean? And she said, oh, they say it's gifted and talented education or something, but we were all kind of like that. That's not a real way we divide you up. They just call it that. And the next morning she came in, and the little 5th graders had gotten a ladder from the custodian who was standing there right below them, and they had a sign they were putting up on their door, and it said, better than GATE. And I think what that says is also what the kids know. The kids are watching and they're seeing all this. Kids in high schools that are not in AP, Advanced Placement, or IB, and go down and sit in a classroom for what they call comprehensive, or they have a different name for it, and see that all the kids in the class are of color. And those more advanced, AP, IB classes are filled with white kids in the building. That's not just a coincidence to them. They understand. And I think that's when you get into some really important parts about tracking. Some really important assumptions that we make about what kids can learn and how we place them. And there are a lot of white parents who know what to do to get their kids into those classes. And we're not making that knowledge accessible often to parents of color. There was a high school that I visited, and I'd been there a couple weeks. And we're really asking the African American kids to try AP classes. And so 3 or 4 of them did. They'd go together, because really, one of the worst experiences that many kids have is being the only one in a class. That is so tough. I tell suburban teachers they have a tough job out there, where there are 2 kids, 2 African American kids, 2 Latino kids in a class. And I do a lot of consulting there, because it's a tricky situation. Often teachers, without thinking, will ask the African American kids to talk about slavery. And so these kids they said, okay, we'll do it. We'll go to AP classes. And 3 or 4 of them went together. And after a couple of weeks, they came back to me and said, and another woman I was working with, another teacher, and said, we don't know if this is really happening, but it seems like the teacher is turning toward the white kids when she has really complicated questions about literature. You know, a lot of concepts, and when she turns toward us when it's simple questions, like where was the writer born, what year, and so I said, well, what do we want to do? And the kid said, do you think we could talk to her, because we really like this teacher. We really like her. So we asked, they said, sure, why don't we just go and talk to the teacher? And we did, and they explained what they were seeing. And the teacher for a moment was very, very quiet. And then she had 2 tears. And she was starting to weep. And she said, you're absolutely right. I did do that. And one of the reasons I did that was because I really didn't want to embarrass you, and I thought you wouldn't know the answer to the complicated question. To me, that says so much. It's so unintentional, but it's there. So she said, from now on, you're going to hear from me, you know? And so the kids would go by me about 2 weeks later and say, oh, God, we're really studying hard now. It's really tough. But they were proud. They were really, really proud that they were hanging in there and making it. But what are we offering all our kids in terms of curriculum? And I think I'm stunned sometimes at how dated we are in schools, in many ways. How outdated. But one of the ways we're outdated is what books kids are asked to read. And what incredible literature is out there. It's out there. And it's written by recent immigrant groups that have come into this country. Brilliant novels, incredible nonfiction. There's a book of nonfiction that I think would be marvelous for a history class called The Warmth of Other Suns by Angela Wilkerson. It's a stunning book where you follow 3 families who immigrate from the deep south to the north, and it's over a period in history. So you see this, you study American history through the eyes of 3 African American families. Because I think what we think of as history is often white history. And we'll plug in, you know, a little week there, a little month there for African American. Somebody pointed out to me, did you notice, Julie, they gave us February. The shortest month of the year. And they say, a lot of people say, look, I'll take that. But really, why don't we weave this in? Why isn't this history? And Peggy McIntosh has done a wonderful way of dividing up, when she goes to schools, to observe curriculum. And she said some schools it's all white. And it's also all white male. And then some schools are representative. So we'll have, as the kids at Central often call it, Harriet Tubman Month. And it's the same black historical figures, which it's good. I mean, it's good to know that. But they've been in school now, you know, 8, 9 years. So they'd really like to see a little bit different approach maybe during that month that includes maybe some more contemporary. And then there are people of color as problems in the curriculum. So that's the curriculum that only talks about the civil rights days and the violence and the Ku Klux Klan, and that only talks about problems that African Americans still have or whatever. it doesn't talk about the full history, the resilience. There's a book, and I can't think of the name of it, I should have written it down, about all the people, African Americans, who fought for civil rights in the South before the time when those of us who went down to work in the civil rights movement in the South. These were people who lived and died in the South, trying to fight to get the right to vote. And I'm not at all minimizing what I think white and black people did together down there. I'm not minimizing the change that happened. But so often the kids read about that. No, really, those white college students went there and they did it, you know, they made alliances and that was great. There's a whole history of people that did so much before any of us got there that did that work. And I think the other point, and I'm almost finished, is I think it does a huge disservice to white students to keep our curriculum white. There is no way you can look at the demographics in the world and in our country and not know that in 10 years, 15 years, these kids in high school are going to be working side by side with people from all different cultures. And I think it's a great thing. I do. But I think those white kids have to have this background and have these conversations too. And I remember being at North at times when the issues would come up. There is something I love about white urban kids, because when they get in there and have the right teacher, like George Roberts, who was there when I was there, when they get in there, they argue, they get tough and they argue back. And I remember listening to this discussion about whether the Beatles took all their music from African Americans. There was this great discussion and got back into what's a spiritual and what's gospel, and it was because the teacher was right there with the kids, and it was because he could develop from their questions a unit that went on into history of literature, went on into whatever. But there's something about being with kids who've been exposed to a lot of these discussions, white kids, who just warm my heart, you know? And that's, a lot of them are going into teaching. A lot of them are. So some of those white folks in teaching are they're coming with a marvelous background in this. They're trying to change things. They're desperately trying to make things work. There was a moment when George at North was tired of seeing in a class of 70% African American kids, seeing in his AP classes that he was getting all the white kids. So he went to the counselor one summer. He said, look, when you schedule kids now for AP English, I want African American and Latino and Native American and Asian kids in there with me. I don't care if they don't have a good grade point average right now. They got to be able to read to do that test. But I just want kids that can read. And there were a group of kids at North of all kinds of cultures that loved George Roberts. So he knew that when they offered an AP class, they'd sign up. And the next year we team taught a novel course together. And he had 70% students of color in that room. That's one man that began to change how we view the smart kids. I'm not sure if it would have been as easy today because the pressure is so great sometimes. I'm just not sure. It was at a time when we were really experimenting a lot in education. We're willing to try things, and we weren't so focused on the tests, so we got to play a little with that. I'm just going to end with a few words from a woman named Ruth Ann Olson, who brings white privilege right back to the schools in an article. And if anybody wants a copy of this, we can get my email to them. And she's done her work with Peggy McIntosh. And so then she has redefined it into what does white privilege look like in the schools? And she is white, so she says, whatever topics my children choose to study, they are confident that they will find materials that link people to their race to the accomplishment in those areas. My children know that they will always see faces like their own, liberally represented in textbook, posters, films, and other materials in the hallways, classrooms, and media centers. When my children talk about celebrations, holidays, or family observances in show and tell, or in other informal exchanges at school, They know that their teachers will have experienced similar events and will be able to reinforce their stories. My children are confident that musical instruments, rhymes, harmonies, visual design form, and dramatic traditions of their culture will be generously recognized in the formal and informal uses of music, theater, and visual arts in their schools. The color of my children's skin causes most adults in school offices, classrooms, and hallways to have neutral or positive assumptions about them. My children know that the vast majority of adults in their schools will be of the same racial background, even in classrooms where many or most of their fellow students are of races different from them. My children are confident that they will never be embarrassed by being called on to tell the class about their race, culture, or special ways of celebrating events. When I visit their schools, my children know that school staff will reserve judgment about my economic class, my level of education, and my reason for being in the school until I make them known. My children take for granted that the color of any crayons, bandages, or other supplies in their classroom labeled flesh will be similar to their own. I take for granted that the tests to judge my children's achievement and to determine placement in special classes have been developed with groups that included significant numbers of students who share our racial history and culture. The last two, my children are confident they will never be embarrassed by hearing others suggest that the problems of the school, low levels of achievement, the need for special support services, are caused by the high numbers of children of their race. I am confident that policy decisions that affect my children's school experience will be made by state and local bodies dominated by people who understand our racial history and culture. So I think she is trying to take this idea of privilege and define it more. And she said there are more, there are many more privileges that she feels her kids have in the schools. But I think she's grasped what it is. And I think you could take that and, yeah. Oh, and I think you could take that and extrapolate it into ideas for different buildings, for what could be done, what's not being done. And the last thing I'll just say is one of the things that really, really bothers me and worries me is I've seen districts where in the same district there are great discrepancies in the resources of kids. Within the district. There'll be a new theater in one school in that district, and there won't be enough paper for art classes in the poorer section of the same district. Teachers are bringing in their own paper by about December. And I don't know what that's about. I don't quite understand that. But I think that's getting to a very systemic way to also look at this.